somewhat questionable 10 minutes for the whole discussion. And I will try to be as succinct as possible. What I found to be curious about this panel is that in a way all three papers approached the question that Yasha asked during his opening remarks, the question, so what is Tamizdat? All these papers approached it apathetically. So with our hope basically to figure out what is Tamizdat by figuring out what it's not. What are its others? While Rosin's remarkably informative paper told us about the anti-Tamizdat, my question is, how do you think, was there a competition? To what extent anti-Tamizdat was working to subvert the real Tamizdat? And what was the reception of Progress and Raduga abroad at the point? To Olga's paper, I think that studying Chukovsky in this context is extremely curious. Since we are using here such term as bridge, Kornei Ivanovich was a completely exceptional, as we all understand, and an unnatural Manians figure that in a way belonged to both shores. Another interesting point for close reading was his remark to Nabokov's Onegin project, of which Chukovsky was the passionate supporter, somewhat exceptional. And his ability to read kind of across the shore, across the division between Gosizdat and Tamizdat, his flexibility, right? And to add his length of his life, following the unforgettable remark of Lydia Ginsburg, that he saw many events of our story that we're discussing here. So in a way, how he connects this position allows us to understand a lot about this position. So I'd like to hear some of the commentaries to my suggestion. To Yasha's paper, it's also, I find it curious that you only 2 last minutes of your paper were dedicated to Tamizdat as such, but mostly the center was about how the famous Novy Mir publication became the event for Tamizdat. The Gosizdat event shapes how Tamizdat thinks, works, publishes, and things like this. Could you talk about this, and then we'll take remaining 1.5 questions.
No, we start in order.
Rosin.
Great, I'll try to be as brief as possible. We're really dealing with the whole spectrum of Russian texts, Russian literature texts abroad, from Progress, which is a Gosizdat, through Louis Aragon's and many other Communist Party affiliated presses, which were also publishing Russian and Soviet literature, which were publishing one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, maybe without the images of barbed wire and blood on their cover pages. Is something like Cleghorn Press in England would be publishing it through Ardius, through Posiv, Posiv being a certain really hardline anti-Soviet press. And as for the competition, to be honest, I think we have people in this audience who can say much more accurately whether there was or there wasn't. My interest, to be honest, has been mostly in the reception of Progress in a number of African and Asian contexts, in some of which it was really immensely important.
Well, to answer your question, I think it, of course, depends on the topic. so happens that it was this topic that had been previously hushed, naturally, but also
We can hear you.
it's okay.
Yeah, it's fine. It's better actually without.
So, paradoxically, the Gosizdat publication opens up, initiates the influx of manuscripts into Tamizdat, especially those on the Gulag topic. And this topic is clearly fulfilling the political mission of Tamizdat much more effectively than the belles lettres or lyric poetry, let's say. It also, nevertheless, it does affect the publication of Van Denisovich. It does affect the way manuscripts on other themes of 20th century read. For example, we have this fascinating story of Evgenia Ginsburg's emancipation of her записки блокадного человека, of her blockade diary, which she starts to rework in 1962. Evidently, Lydia, of course. Evidently preparing her text for for submission, but never actually submitting it anywhere, and never letting it view the world. So it never materializes, but it does have the triple date underneath when it is first published in, I think, 1984, right? 1941, 1962, the year that she works on it and reworks it, and 1984, which tells us something about how that publication serves as a medium or axis of that span of several decades. Not only as far as it concerns the Gulag and Stalinism, but the war and
The totalitarian subject.
yeah.
Just any questions or comments on? Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I just wanted to say a few words. That I'm not sure whether Tchaikovsky is unique in his own way, because there are other people like Zamyatin. Zamyatin brings his Englishness back.
He's
No,
much earlier, right?
Zamyatin is earlier, and
I understand.
And got
He
some
brings his
disappears.
Englishness
Yeah.
back to Russia and disappears, but we still have a little bit of that in.
I think
Doesn't work.
Edinburgh is much more.
Edinburgh,
For example,
I
it's
think
the
so.
same flexible position. Yeah.
yeah. So do you think this is not?
Soviet people are flexible in general. You know? Probably that was the best example.
Well,
But in children's literature, the fact that he is
certain Soviet people.
representing, in the 60s, he's already the father and the founder and the most resonant voice and the most citable and memorable children's poet. And when he goes to Oxford, that's what Isaiah Berlin says in his lecture. He's a scholar, but everyone knows him as a like of Edward Lear. For Tchaikovsky, this is a tragedy. His work that is most famous in the motherland cannot be translated. So how does he convey what he has developed as a children's poet to the reader abroad? To me, the fascinating part of it is that he does it through the work of propaganda, which should have never been even authored by Tchaikovsky, which should have never been signed by his name. He had to do it because his name had a certain ring to it, a certain recognition. And he inserts some of his familiarity with their British audiences' tradition, British audiences' recognition of certain tropes, its fascination with active, plucky, resourceful young men and women and whatnot. But he cannot be heard as a poet until Cole translates his Crocodile. Progress, by the way, does some of the work. I have a list of publications of Progress publishers' translations of Tchaikovsky into English, but that's after Cole.
I'm sorry. I can just add something perhaps to Chukovsky's.
Audience wants to participate, so can you agree?
Sure. At the same time, he corresponds secretly with Roman Greenberg, the publisher of Воздушные пути in New York, who adopts the pen name of Sonia Gordon. And I think Chukovsky is quite carried away here, but they do correspond quite passionately for several years and about Tamizdat, including the publication of Chukovsky's drawings.
It's all good.
As far as Tamizdat and Gosizdat, if we don't make a distinction, that is, the distinction between publishable and unpublishable, because that's sort of the origin, right, of Tamizdat. You can't publish here, so you send it abroad to publish, or you publish at home somehow by yourself. I think if we lose that distinction, in a sense, then we have to redefine Tamizdat. What does it mean? Because, yeah, talking about Ivan Denisov, sorry, I really enjoyed your talk, but talking about it in the same breath as, I think you talked about Sinyavsky, right? Or didn't you mention
Yes.
socialist
Yeah.
realism, right? Somehow, I think we lose the topic. Or we have to really rethink. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking that we have to rethink what it is that we're talking about when we say Tamizdat. Yeah? And as far as socialist realism goes in Ivan Denisovich, I'm really curious what makes it socialist realist. I mean, I do know that his labor, he is fulfilled when he works, right? He's happy then. And that feels socialist realist. But I'm curious, how else would we describe Ivan Denisovich as socialist realist? Now, I realize that this is not a Tamizdat question at the same time. Yeah. But I'm curious what we all think about the Gos and Tamizdat.
Thank you so much, Olga. We're having a round table tomorrow, and I think we should just
Talk
open
about
with
that.
this
Okay,
question. That
let's
would
wait
be
for it till
remarkable,
tomorrow.
because
Sounds
it
good.
is the purpose of our meeting, I would
Mhm.
say the main purpose and one
Makes
of the
sense.
defining points. Irina?
I think one thing about
Yeah.
we have to keep in mind about Solzhenitsyn is that when Khrushchev went in October 1964, everybody said the consequences for literature are going to be that Solzhenitsyn will not be able to be published anymore.
Yes.
So in some senses, and of course he published these that you referred already to Macedonian War 63, so he did publish after it one day. Published two-
Macedonian Bor was not after?
After, I said after.
Oh, after.
You
Okay, I
did publish
know.
after.
Mhm.
Okay, but after Khrushchev went, he was
Yeah.
not able to publish
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah, yeah.
And in
There's
some ways,
yeah.
Tamizdat, I mean, obviously, as you well pointed out to us, in some ways it began with the publication of Dr. Zhivago, but it took off in a big way after Khrushchev
Yes.
went.
You're right.
Samizdat and Tamizdat
Yes.
both became huge,
Mhm.
and then you had the trials of Sinyavsky,
Mhm.
Daniel, Brodsky, etc.
Exactly.
This is all in the
Yes.
wake of Khrushchev going, and so it's a very real question what might have happened had Khrushchev. I mean, already the thaw of '62 was
Waning, yeah.
waning, yes.
Mhm.
So, but it is a very real question what might have happened had Khrushchev remained in power, specifically in terms of Tamizdat. Yes.
Yes, just small comment about this official propaganda in a way. Just a small and very fun example. 2 years ago I was in India when I met the Indian publishers, and occurred that at least 2 generations of Indian publishers grew up on Russian fairy tales. And even many of these young women, presumably they're women in publishing, they were quite a lot of them were wearing Russian names. just because of that. So we came, we started discussing something, and something sounded like Baba Yaga, Kashmir, I said, what, why? And they said because of these beautiful books, they were very beautiful and they were very cheap because of propaganda. This is the only books really that they could afford to buy. So strangely enough, I would say, somehow, whether this official propaganda planned or not, but somehow it happened, you know, in a strange way. And about Solzhenitsyn and Twardowski individual taste, should we bear in mind, even including Khrushchev, that all the generation of people who somehow had some power, they were coming from the low social stratas. So all these intellectual things, by the way, were just not, they were not so much hostile, but that was not their experience, in a way. And on the other hand, the problem was that there was only one so-called progressive journal at the moment. It was Novy Mir. Could we imagine for some time if there were two, and the other editor-in-chief have a little different tastes? Probably, you know, the Soviet people could redefine social realism many times, you know, persuading that could be called social realism. We could have a different picture. You know, that's only because of the monopoly, you know.
It would have been so much less centralized and give so much more
socialist competition.
Yes, in a way, in a way.
Sure.
That's a kind of matter of chance because, at least as far as I remember, the later stages of the Soviet Union, the major task of all people in publishing industry is to persuade that this or that person could be called either socialist realist as still a realist. And we did it wonderfully. So in this way, it was called a game of chance.
This, I should have emphasized the pathos of this term, socialist realism, which is by no means, it's beyond the categories of, you know, if it's socialist realist, then it's like bad taste or simply bad.
It's not pejorative. Right?
It's not pejorative. So there is an argument in correspondence between Kopylov and Solzhenitsyn. Of course, we can only read Kopylov's letters, in one which he responds to Solzhenitsyn's being insulted by his former Sharashka mate and friend and prototype of Rubin in the в круге первом. And Kopylov writes, don't you remember that for me, socialist realism was a positive, it was a praise, not pejorative in any means. And then Georg Lukács, of course, famously describes Solzhenitsyn as Solzhenitsyn's novels and Ivan Denisovich as the model обновление соцреализма.
Renaissance.
Yeah, the renaissance, right, of socialism. So it's
Renewal.
huh?
Renewal.
Renewal.
Rejuvenation.
Which tells us something about how much bigger it is as a phenomenon, socialist realism. It's still real.
Right. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the fact that one day was about the camps is not in itself so extraordinary in the sense that Yuri Bondin published Tishina in the same year, before Solzhenitsyn did, in which the hero went to the camps unjustifiably. So it would seem that this was building, and examples that you mentioned. The authors could have seen themselves as potentially participating in this new wave, but the wave that they were allowed to press. But it was not only Solzhenitsyn.
But was Yuri Bondin's work published in Novy Mir or elsewhere?
I believe Novy Mir.
So that was just one point where these things
Yeah.
could be happening at that time under
Right.
that editor.
Right.
So that was an exceptional time,
Right.
and I think that should be considered.
It was.
You were waiting a long time.
Exceptional time.
Yeah, no,
in
just
literary
in
history,
conjunction,
that
I
is
understand
one
exactly.
exception.
Sorry, what you are saying, Olga, that we will have to leave this for that round table. But wouldn't it be, you know, I don't see particularly why what you, Yasha, call us like having
exceptional longevity, being that just the renewal in Solzhenitsyn, for example, of the good old social, not socialist realism, or as we say, критический реализм, because it's no longer propaganda. It's not a propaganda art. It just has vestiges of socialist realism that it shares with.
Critical realism was most particularly used in the Soviet period as a classification of the sort of writing which would be acceptable for a Westerner. So critical realism was largely
Did you say for Western?
for a Western writer. Critical realism was largely a term applied to Western writers critiquing bourgeois society. That was critical realism, and the models that came out of Balzac, the 19th century Balzac in particular, but 19th century novels. But socialist realism, of course, was specifically it was meant to be universally applicable, but it was largely a Soviet phenomenon because it did involve affirmation of the status quo.
What I'm saying is the longevity of this. It's like Sobibor that you mentioned, the recent movie, right? It's more about narrative techniques rather than anything else. That the positive hero and the narrative technique and the criticism is basically socially engaged literature in some way, in critical way.
It's heroic. Has to be about
It has to
heroes.
have redemption.
Unlike Dostoevsky, whose characters are by no means
Well, I
heroic.
think there's a lot of heroism there.
We got to go.
Excuse me, more questions.
Well,
Can we take questions?
we can before, if I may just interject, let's, so the internet it has never happened here before for as long as I've been at Hunter, but the internet apparently is still down, and the next event we have on the schedule is the website, which I can still do using hotspot. So, but we should probably cut a little bit the time allocated for it, especially that right after we have the unveiling or opening of the book exhibition. So I would suggest maybe take 1-2 more questions, then have a quick coffee and come back at not at 4, but at 4.
But maybe
30.
not about socialist realism, as you were all saying. We'll discuss it tomorrow. No?
I think the question of
Like
socialist realism is totally
Or well, then the socialist realism.
connection, because it's a question of editorial policies, and it has rather to do, as Olga said, with проходимость, непроходимость, публикабельность, непубликабельность, and it has nothing to do with socialist realism.
Absolutely.
No, because then you will find some kind of maybe socialist realist kind of tones in the choice of rhetoric that the editor is choosing to reject. Like, for instance, I agree with you completely. This phrasing, subjectively unhappy, objectively happy. This is a very Stalinist form of formulating why your enemy might be correct in his own small sphere, and why on a higher level he is certainly the enemy of the people. That was typical form, but that has nothing to do with the definition of socialist realism, and don't go into it. It's about editorial politics. But then on the other hand, in Tamizdat, you know yourself, and you made such a wonderful presentation last year about it, each Tamizdatchik also has his editorial politics. So how it's the question of institutional kind of translation. It's not about socialist realism, which plays absolutely it's not important here. You're just leading your discussion somewhere far, far, far away.
But socialist realism itself was institutionally established.
Yes, it
So
was.
I
I just
agree
don't know what
that
it's.
the institution was not.
But socialist realism doesn't have any essentialist value. We shouldn't discuss socialist realism essentially. We should discuss it institutionally and politically as part of policies. Otherwise, we just go into discussions which lead us into circles.
Yeah, socialist realism requires a certain type of hero. As Yasha said, it has to be heroic one way or another.
But not only socialist realism.
Yeah.
I
Only
mean,
socialist realism.
Greek myth also requires a kind of
Yeah, but-
heroism.
Questions?
I think that we speak about social realism, which is much more becoming more heated dispute
Yes.
than Tamizdat. But we should bear in mind this is total control of literature and other arts. And I would say it's really ideological. It's not aesthetical, it's ideological phenomenon. And that's why it's very difficult to pinpoint the social realism, because the demands of ideology changed all the time. So that's why people could not understand why on a certain point they were praised and on other they were punished for the same type of writing. So that was because literature and and culture in general was, I would say, made of ideology. That's why we have quite a lot of inexplicable things. And it's impossible to find some aesthetic criteria for the moment.
Well,
But
there is. I mean, after all, aesthetics were ideologized. I mean, I was saying, why couldn't Andrei Bikhov's Pushkin House be published in 78?
Because how else does ideology
Because-
make
Because thanks to
aesthetics.
Clement Greenberg, the Cold War was conducted as modernism versus
Exactly.
realism.
Exactly.
And both sides.
we can speak
both
about
sides
conservative
pardon their
taste
position.
of the people
Okay.
who were in charge,
That
but
is-
trying to find aesthetic logic is what was going on. I think
There
it's
is no
futile
logic.
task.
Logic.
No, but at the same time, there was some
Aesthetics
kind
are
of
highly
collective
ideologized.
intuition about what kind of writing is possible and what kind of. And trying to
Well,
so
yes.
Ginsburg, Lydia Ginsburg writes a lot about it. That everybody
Yes.
knew what kind of writing could be published, and nobody could explain why. That's
I think
interesting.
we are in the bit,
That's it.
we are Where are the crocodiles?
I think this conversation we can easily transform
Transfer
into
to the
a
I have a